She's a member of the Alliance of the Southern Triangle, AST, a collaboration of architects and curators, and the Office of Applied Complexity for research and development that traverses conceptual terrains with an aim to construct new models for work between art, science, technology, and power. Her talk today will be on forms, modes, and sources of alienation. She starts with Seller's concept of a difference between sentience and sapience, so how much rationality alienates us, and follows up with a critique of Metzinger's philosophy of knowledge that takes the self and the subject and its experience as a given, whilst the self and the world are a product of our brain work. So, welcome, Diann Bauer.
Thanks. So I realize one of the problems when you write an abstract for something like this, before you actually write the paper, you end up writing about something other than you say you're going to write about. So I still am going to talk about the productivity of alienation and horror, and the reality of horror being not in the moments when you are confronted with the monster, the alien, the thing that will mean your end, but the contemplation of that vulnerability, the cognition of finitude. And this itself is productive for thinking and indeed remaking the species. To briefly give an introduction as to why I'm speaking about the productivity of alienation to begin with, it comes from this text that we've mentioned a number of times this morning, Xenofeminism, A Politics for Alienation, written by Laboria Cubonics, of which both Helen and I are members, along with 4 other women spread across the globe. And we wrote the manifesto in 2015 collectively. So knowing that some of you are more familiar with the XF project than others, I will go ahead and speak a bit first about one of the ways that we use the concept of alienation in the Xenofeminist Manifesto and try to build out from there. I also want to say that the work I'm presenting here is relatively preliminary and is part of a broader look at what exactly is meant by alienation in the Xenofeminist Manifesto. So I'm hoping to use some of the conversations this weekend to try and flush some of this stuff out. But to begin with, I will start with a quote from the manifesto itself. So XF, which I use to refer to xenofeminism often through the paper, XF seizes alienation as an impetus to generate new worlds. We are all alienated, but have we ever been otherwise? It is through and not despite our alienated condition that we can free ourselves from the muck of immediacy. Freedom is not given, and it is certainly not given by anything natural. The construction of freedom involves not less but more alienation. Alienation is the labor of freedom's construction. Nothing should be accepted as fixed, permanent, or given, neither material conditions nor social forms. So what do we mean by alienation? There are risks in using this term. Attempting to reclaim and in some ways reorient a word that has so much weight in both the history of political thought as well as common parlance is no small task. There are risks of miscommunication and misunderstanding. So first of all, it's a relational term. Something or someone is alienated from something or someone else. We are all alienated, or have we ever been otherwise? The argument is that as long as we have been sapient, we have been alienated. This alienation is on the scale of the species, what we are as human and what we have the capacity to become. And I'm making the distinction here between sapience and sentience. I take this from Ray Brazier, who takes it from Wilfrid Sellers. I'm using sapience to mean the human ability to use reason to both reflect and consciously act on her world, and by extension, to construct it. While sentient being is one that has awareness of their surroundings, but not necessarily the capacity to deliberately reflect and act on it. I want to briefly read a fable from the horror fiction writer Thomas Ligotti from his book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. It illustrates nicely the break between sapience and sentience. So this is Ligotti. For ages they had been without lives of their own, The whole of their being was open to the world, and nothing divided them from the rest of creation. How long they had thus flourished, none of them knew. Then some began to change. It happened over unremembered generations. The signs of a revision, without forewarning, were being writ ever more deeply into them. As their species moved forward, they began crossing boundaries whose very existence they never imagined. After nightfall, they looked up at the sky filled with stars and felt themselves small and fragile in the vastness. Soon they began to see everything in a way that they never had in older times. When they found one of their own lying still and stiff, they now stood around the body as if it were something, as if there were something they should do that they had never done before. It was then that they began to take the bodies that were still and stiff to distant places so that they could not find their way back to them. But even after they had done this, some within their group did see those bodies again, often standing silent in the moonlight or loitering sad-faced just beyond the glow of a fire. Everything changes once they had lives of their own, and they knew they had lives of their own. It even became impossible for them to believe things they had ever been any other way. They were masters of their movements now, and it seemed there had never been anything like them. The epoch had passed, when the whole of their being was open to the world, nothing divided from the rest of creation. Something had happened. They did not know what it was, but they did know that it was as that which should not be, and something needed to be done if they were to flourish as they once had, if the ground beneath their feet were not to fall out from under them. For ages they had been without lives of their own, and now that they had such lives, there was no turning back. The whole of their being was closed to the world, and they had been divided from the rest of creation. Nothing could be done about that, having, as they did, lives of their own. But something would have to be done if they were to live with that which should not be. And over time, they discovered what could be done, what would have to be done so they could live the lives that were now theirs. This would not revive among them the ways things once had been done in older times. It would only be the best they could do. On one level, this parable is very useful. It demonstrates the kind of alienation I'm interested in that it describes this alienation between sapience and sentience. But rather than understand this as a means to access what we could be and what we could become as a species, his conclusion is that we do our best despite this. XF argues that, on the contrary, we do our best because of this alienation. So our shift to what Ligeti calls that which should not be is the shift where we as a species went from the capacity to feel terror Okay. So the capacity to feel terror to the capacity to comprehend dread.
Last word. What? I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
As soon as we could reason beyond our biological needs, we were already alienated. So when Ligeti speaks about that which should not be, I don't know if he literally means that somehow, only if we could, return to the way things had been done in older times, or if this is just poetic license. But this is exactly the kind of reverence for nature that XF completely disavows. XF is the complete rejection of the idea there's some purported natural way or natural order that was somehow better. So for Ligeti, there is identification of this estrangement, the alienation of the species from itself through evolution, through knowing what we know, knowing our finitude, saying it is that which should not be. XF, rather, takes this moment of alienation at the level of the species as the point from which we can build what we can become. It is this condition that enables us to plan, to plot, to discern. It ought to be like this for these reasons. It is this form of alienation that has enabled the species to be as successful as it currently is. And when I say successful here, I am not making a moral judgment. I just mean that in our dominance as a species, in the ability to avoid extinction, as well as do some rather amazing things, space travel and antibiotics prove good examples of this. So on a broad scale, at the scale of the species, alienation from our biology via sapience is a productive force. The ability as a species to self-reflect and in turn make and remake what is human is one of the ways XF avows alienation. And to be clear, this is not just the liberty to make or do more stuff because we are clever apes. It is the ability to abandon reverence for a divine or a given nature of how things are. It is the ability as a species to self-reflect and in turn make and remake what we are, what is human. This will allow us to become something else. This will allow us to expedite evolution. It is not, as Ligeti calls it, that which should not be. Also, there is no should about it. Should according to whom? Should or shouldn't isn't relevant here. There is no theological order. There is no way to put a moral judgment on whether we ought to have sapience or not. Nor is it a should, as in we should not be subject to dread. This is not a sufficient reason why it should not be. Sapience does come with horror, but as this horror is part of what we are, indeed part of what we are, sapient horror is different in kind from the fight or flight sentient horror that we've had access to along with most of the animal kingdom. It is living with the knowledge of our finitude. So I want to take this alienation a step further. The alienation from sapience to sentience can be said to be an alienation from ourselves, an internal rupture or a delamination of what we are. And where this starts to become more pronounced is through the work of philosopher Thomas Metzinger, whose focus is on philosophy of mind, the philosophy of science, and neuroscience. I'm going to primarily speak about it through an essay written by James Trafford called The Shadow of a Puppet Dance, Metzinger, Ligeti, and the Illusion of Selfhood, because he has already done what I think is a very productive work on linking Metzinger and Ligeti. Of Thomas Metzinger's works, specifically Metzinger's book, Being No One, Trafford says this: despite formidable and technical complexity, the upshot of Metzinger's analysis could not be more clear. No such things as selves exist in the world. Nobody ever was or had a self. Consequently, consciousness is only an appearance, according to Metzinger. Organisms are not selves, rather they possess self-models, which cannot be recognized by the system that employs them. All that exists are specific information processing systems engaged in self-modeling, but whose models cannot be correlated with any ostensibly real items in the world. Now, I understand Metzinger here not to be saying that it's all a dream, or that there are no correlates in reality, just that there is no, or at least very limited ways of knowing how close our neurochemically produced model of reality correlates with something outside of it. The reality that appears to us is one that evolved as an efficient way for us to survive and evolve as a species, and how much our perceived model corresponds to a reality outside itself is up to conjecture. Okay, I'm going to show, I have a very long clip now, so I'm wondering if we can even dim the lights for this. It's 8 minutes. It's from a film called Jacob's Ladder. It's a Hollywood flick. It's not my work, but that'll be obvious very quickly. So it's an example of an individual passing through competing phenomenal models. The self remains consistent, but how that self constructs an understanding of what is happening to him keeps shifting. I hope it'll let me get back to what Metzinger calls nemocentrism, which is basically no one at the controls, a no-one-centeredness, as a productive condition akin to the kind of alienation that is avowed in the XF project. So, I'll just play this. I'm not sure how much of the narrative of the film I need to actually spell out for this whole thing to be clear, or if it's evident, but we'll start with the clip that I've showed at least. So we've got our protagonist, Jacob Singer, and the scene that I show starts with a car chase, and it's an adrenaline fight or flight. And this is sentience, though sapience too. Thinking takes time, and time as a result, I would say sapience is limited as time is limited here. When we were in those situations, we're flooded with chemicals that help us stay alive by the fight or flight or getting the hell out. And I would presume that it's these same chemicals that appear to make time stretch, giving the brain time to reason, time that would otherwise not be available. there's a difference in the kind of horror that Jake is being subjected to in the opening scenes, this adrenaline-filled scene, and then the later scene where he's laid out and on what he realizes is a mortician's slab, which would be a state of terror and dread at the same time. It echoes the difference between sentience and sapience, though it's also probably more a matter of degrees rather than absolutes here. We all know that we will each end up there at some point, on the slab, that is, and we hope we're not sentient when we're there, like Jacob is. He knows what's happening to him, and he knows this is the real horror. In his moments of knowing, thinking, his moments of sapience, his moments of reason, rather than just surviving, or extending to the moment just before I cut, where it seems like all is going well and he's better and his family's there and all that, until we hear this disembodied voice, presumably the schizoid inner voice of Jacob himself, saying, "Dream on." The general narrative of the film, Jacob is dying. It starts in Vietnam, and the whole of the film is the process of him coming to a very violent end, though we are to believe through most of it, through Jake, through his perspective, that that what he is experiencing is, in fact, the world, and that what he is experiencing correlates to an external reality. We realize in the final scene, and I realize I'm sort of ruining the film for those of you who haven't seen it, but it's still worth seeing even if you know what's going on. The 2 hours of the film is a narrative his brain has constructed chemically to produce a world, a sufficiently rich set of constraints for conscious experience, to use Metzinger's words, not about the film, but about consciousness. But in Jacob's case, is this process of dying over a 24-hour period. You are given clues to this throughout the film, where there are cuts to scenes in Vietnam. Like there's one in the middle of this where you see the sky, and this is sort of one of those points where it cuts back to him going through this period of dying, where they say, we're losing him, we're losing him. And this is, I hope, where I can go back to Metzinger's namocentrism. He says that there is no such thing as a self, and that our transparent phenomenal self model and the experience we appear to have is a neurochemically produced process. No one has ever had a self, he says. So what appears to be normal waking life is ontologically not that different from the bulk of experiences had by our Jacob Singer. Totally convincing as an outside world, but constructed internally, and any correlation to the real is unclear. So returning to James Trafford's text, as a way to start stitching some of this together, he makes the link between Metzinger and Ligeti, saying the transcendental illusion exposed by Metzinger is expanded to total disparity between the interests of life and the interests that life finds itself within. The secure foundations of the phenomenological and the real dissolve not into a universal solipsism, but into a rigorous realism. It is not, in the end, a replacement of the real world by the unreal, but a sort of turning the real world inside out to show that it was unreal all along. Where Metzinger definitively resolves to destroy the possibility of synthesis of man and nature, it is through Ligeti's phenomenological fictionalization that the effective ramifications of this move are elucidated. I think it's also elucidated by Jacob's ladder. So what to do with this? How can laying sentient on a mortician's slab in any way be productive or emancipatory? Well, okay, the specifics of our protagonist's situation in this narrative seems indeed more destructive, both physiologically and psychologically, but if we can abstract into more general condition for being human, it gives us access to a realism that has shifted. There is something emancipatory about the decentering of experiential and as a primary means of understanding the world, knowing our experiences are ontologically unreliable in relation to an external real. This is not to say that appearances we live in are not important. This is indeed not to be a vertigo-inducing existential point of crisis. Rather, it produces a realism that lays bare alienation between sapient and sentient that I began with, the alienation that the xenofeminist manifesto is building on. This estrangement, this alienation through which humans have historically been so evolutionarily successful, in combination with developments and understanding of what we are, in part made it possible through work done in contemporary neuroscience, specifically in relationship to how we understand consciousness, but also through expansion of what the human is through technology, more broadly, allows us new ground from which to build. We must develop a new set of commitments, enabling deliberate orientation of our evolution via the complex systems we are already part of. we are at a point in history when our evolution is starting to be expedited. So Ligoti's claim that that which should not be can shift to that which is and can be deliberately constructed otherwise. It's already happening. And I do have examples, actually, but I'm a bit worried about time, so there's a whole other bit that I could go into around examples of the human as part of, as a systemic thing that operates around the planet through things like GPS and how that relates to time, but I'm sort of disinclined to go into that and would rather open to questions, and if it comes to that, we can come back to that in questions.
Are there questions already?
For the moment, it's not a question, but my desire that if you can say a few words more, it is related to time, and it is related to the passage to the sentience, the different types of time of this passage, because obviously if we lean on that film, there is the traumatic event. Okay, the traumatic event, the hero of that film is probably wounded or almost dying, okay? So there is the time of realizing whatever it is, the distance between the real and whatever he makes of it.
The whole time question is a real area of interest for me, and one of my main interests is this, is around whether you can, how much you can access a time outside of phenomenological time, and also the way phenomenological time itself behaves so differently. So in moments of trauma, it's sort of I have not done studies on this, I'm not a neuroscientist, it's more, in fact, experiential. When you have these moments of trauma and time extends, and it got me thinking, well, this must be evolutionarily, it allows us more time. It gives you that time to access reason. It gives you that time to make decisions in a way that you wouldn't have in normal experience of time. So that's one aspect of time that I'm particularly interested in, but also, for example, how humans, how we understand time outside of ourselves, and how that is having real impacts in how we navigate the world. So with something like GPS, for example, so you have, in general relativity, time stretches in relation to a point of gravity. So this needs to be calculated for with GPS satellites because of their distance from the Earth, and so we are on the surface of the Earth.
So this is space-time already, and the fields of space-time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And so that we had no evolutionary need to be able to experience or understand this. But now we're at a point where actually it's necessary. These satellites won't work unless these calculations are made.
I don't want to interrupt the discussion, but I do have a question concerning where the horror takes place. You said in the beginning that horror does not take place with the encounter, but with the moment of its contemplation. And later you said that you can feel horror and comprehend dread. So some shift took place that actually on the level of its contemplation there is no horror anymore.
It's dread.
But it's dread.
I think so.
But when you showed us the scene from Alien, you undertitled not horror but terror. So I thought, is there something that you think on the level of sentience it's actually not horror but terror, and on the level of sapience it is horror?
I mean, I'll start with the dread, horror, terror thing. And I was thinking about this, and I was trying to think, well, maybe horror is the combination of terror and dread. I mean, it might be that moment when he's on the slab and experiencing both. Because it seemed to me that terror would be just that moment of like, fuck, get me out of here, or whatever, like fight, flight, pure survival, animal, like lizard brain, like straight lizard brain. And that dread is this knowledge of finitude, and that perhaps horror is some merging of the two. And I think I am sort of making a distinction between those, and I think horror, I do think horror probably sort of umbrellas both. Is sort of the culminating of I mean, because certainly as sapient beings, we can still feel that animal terror. Like, I mean, that, of course, fortunately not very often, but it happens.
Thanks.